Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tiffin History Podcast, where we serve you bite sized content about topics relevant to our past, present, and future. In this series, we connect you with top experts from a variety of fields to answer your pressing questions. We have a very special guest today for our very first episode. Debayan Gupta is currently an assistant professor of computer science at Ashoka University, where he teaches a course on security and privacy. He has earned his doctorate from Yale University and taught at MIT. He also consults and advises for companies on cybersecurity. Professor Gupta has too many interests and talents to list off, but some of them include secure computation, cryptography, and privacy. We're glad to have his experienced perspective on the issues of surveillance and technology that have become even more relevant today in the wake of the Pegasus scandal. Professor Gupta, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Great. Well, we have one question for you. Well, quite a few, but one that's, I think, something that we've heard a lot around campus and something that our viewers at home might be interested in as well. People are increasingly concerned about government surveillance in the wake of the Pegasus scandal. What can you tell us about the history of state surveillance in India? How did we get here?
Okay, how many hours do we have for that question? No, it's state surveillance is not new, clearly. It's been around for a very long time. And I think it's useful to focus only on independent India when we look at the history of surveillance. And that is marked by two sort of bad ideas. One is this essential attitude that the government has a right to all the communications that you have, right? This was somewhat balanced by a sort of Victorian prejudice against it, sort of it being impolite to read somebody else's letters. But that was about it, very honestly, right? For those of you who are interested in the legal side of this, you can look up the LIM, the Lawful Intercept and Monitoring legal infrastructure that has been put in place. I won't go too deep into it, but I'll just say one sentence, which is, you know that a law is bad that when it has the word lawful in it. You know, it implies you're going to read the law and be like, that there is no way that's legal. It says lawful right at the title. That's essentially how bad it is. A lot of the stuff that you see in TV dramas and stuff, the problem is that a lot of us, especially in the urban elites that tend to talk about these things, we're not Indian, really. We're fake Americans. And we somehow assume that we have the same kinds of rights that exist, say, in the US, right? We don't. Indian surveillance rules are pretty bad. All of those things you think about, oh, police need a warrant to do this, turns out for a lot of the stuff, they don't, right? The core difference, I think, to consider here is that in the case of many other countries, surveillance may be worse, let's say in Britain or in the US, technically speaking, but a lot of that is held by intelligence authorities, right? Whereas in India, the number of oversight mechanisms are so low that there's a lot of crossover between these authorities, right? This applies to everything. This applies to even the sort of simpler things like, say, internet shutdowns, right? So it's not just surveillance, it's about, so for example, with internet shutdowns, who can order one? Turns out that's not so clear. It's not as if, some dude in, Amit Shah isn't picking up the phone and saying, order this shutdown every single time. It turns out almost any senior officer can just do it. It's not any, but it's a very large number of people. And the reasons are myriad. So suddenly you have this very weird, chaotic structure where companies don't know whom to obey, right? So it's always coming from a quote unquote monolithic government, but the government isn't monolithic, right? I think that chaos is what has really, that is the core of India's surveillance infrastructure. No one quite knows what's going on. And therefore, you kind of have to obey whatever command comes to you if you're a private company with personal data of individuals. And I think that is where a lot of the problems come from, that you need to clear a lot of that out.
Thank you for that. I think that was a really comprehensive answer. The question that comes to my mind now is that you talked about other countries like Great Britain and China and how they use a lot more surveillance on their citizens, but that at the same time, they also have more clear lines of command, so to speak. We know who to blame. My question then is that now that we've entered the information age, we're facing all of these new problems that our societies aren't really accustomed to dealing with. This vast new sweep of social media platforms, of online dynamics, they're shaking a lot of things up. The next question is specifically about how in the past, the spread of information across the nation was primarily through newspapers and mail. With the flood of information on social media, how different is the relationship between the public and information? It feels like the decentralization, that blurring of lines that you were talking about, it's applied to the public relationship as much as it is a government one.
Oh, wow, you have very long questions. I'll break that up into two. So first of all, in the previous answer, I definitely did not mention China as a place where you knew what was going on. That is not the case. I was mentioning, I think, UK and US. China is like way worse. But in this particular question that you're asking, this moving into social media and people don't quite know what's going on, I think there are many layers to that, right? So first of all, there is the availability paradox issue. I won't call it a paradox, really. People tend to mistake information for expertise. I read one article on something and I think I know it, right? The usual language for this is information plus context is knowledge, and knowledge plus experience is expertise, right? But people tend to just take the information and immediately think they know something, right? And that's very, very, very dangerous. Now, what you said before, that knowledge used to spread in newspapers, there was a time before that also. So if you go way back when, knowledge was spread by sort of the king's or queen's messengers, and then they had a stranglehold on what was spread beyond rumors. The merchants' guilds also had their own information networks usually. And then that changed. You had the fourth estate, as it were, to come, that came up. And people recognized that this was power in its own way, and they wanted to regulate it. And this was regulated not just in legal ways, but very sort of a social core fashion, which meant that editors were meant to be neutral, or at least open about their biases, right? That it's sort of like being a judge. Your job was to be neutral about something, right? About reporting the news honestly. There was a certain set of social norms that applied to you. And if you disobeyed those norms, you were a bad person, right? And this worked because you were targeting a small number of publishers, essentially, right? Now you move into today's era where everyone's a publisher, everyone's a journalist, everyone's an analyst. And now you have this false feeling that, hey, the New York Times is one Twitter handle, Debayan ABCD is another Twitter. I don't know if that's a real Twitter handle or not, but Debayan ABCD is another Twitter handle. And so we tend to ascribe unconsciously similar feelings to it, that if I say something, it's because I agree with it. And therefore, if the New York Times says something, it means they agree with it. Everything becomes an opinion, not just a reporting of fact. And that can be extremely dangerous, right? Because now I am taking a reporting of an incident as essentially as a statement of support, right? And worse than that is the fact that the internet runs on ads, right? Because it runs on ads, even viewing an opposing viewpoint is making them money, right? And people do think this way. This is very, very, very common, that, hey, you shouldn't read blah newspaper because that's making the wrong side money. Even reading Times of Israel, watching Fox News, whatever your blend of hatred is, you say that that's not okay. And this is naturally going to cause some very, very, very bad bubbles to form, right? And this is without even taking into account sort of the so-called, people say, oh, the algorithm is making me bad. Sure it is. But the comparison I like to draw in this case is that the very fact that you're connecting so many people together might be bad. It sounds like such a great thing that Facebook says, oh, we're connecting all the, well, it turns out that humans aren't very good at that, right? We're very good at being tribal and living in small communities. And we're good at treating strangers well when they come in small doses, right? But actually sort of integrating with a larger community, maybe humans aren't so good at that at all, actually, from what it appears to, from how things appear to be. Because what we're seeing is, let me try and describe this. So I teach this new geography course where I use the same metaphor. Let's say you go to a cricket game, right? And you have this huge crowd. Think of each person in the crowd as an arrow. Everyone's pointed towards the center field. Everyone's looking at the cricket. Why? Well, because that's what they're here for. They paid for tickets and they came to the game. That is, this crowd is not a random crowd. This crowd has self-selected to come to this game, right? That is, these are the people in the population who went out and bought tickets to come to this game, and therefore they're all watching it. This sounds okay, Debayan, why are you telling me this? This sounds very stupid. Bear with me for 2 minutes. You have all these arrows pointing at the cricket game being played. Now, this is a crowd, and the reason for this crowd, the cause and effect, the cause of this crowd existed before the crowd came to be, right? And this allows the crowd to act in a coherent manner. That is, all the arrows are pointing towards the middle of the field. Now, if you now put forth an impulse, so let's say a fire breaks out. Now, what's going to happen is different people, unless they've trained in fire drills or whatever, the signage is very clear, people are going to react in different ways, right? Because people are different. Now, just because everyone came to a cricket game doesn't mean everyone's going to react to a fire or something else in exactly the same way. They may be different along those axes. So everyone's going to react in a different way. And we know what happens when an impulse comes after a crowd. We get stampedes, we get riots, so on and so forth, right? So if you have a crowd and then you create a cause, you push an impulse through that crowd, because different people react in different ways, you get chaos. Now, this doesn't happen very often, fortunately, in real life, right? Except in the virtual world, a social network is a permanent virtual crowd without an a priori reason. It is a permanent group of people who are connected to each other with impulses, that is, news bulletins, opinion pieces, whatever else, sort of flashing through this network. And it is inevitable that you're going to have essentially chaos. You're going to have different groups of people react in different ways. And because everyone is connected to everyone else, you're going to have banding together of these similar subgroups. And as different impulses come through, they're going to band together around a small group of core reasons. And they will force, and you'll just say, look, I agree with this group on A, B, and C. With everything else, I'll just conform because A, B, and C are too important to leave. And you pretty much by definition get these kinds of bubbles, right? And then you have Facebook's algorithms and so on and so forth doing that stuff on top. So you're already in trouble just because of the nature of this. And then you have sort of algorithms deciding, hey, if I make you super angry, turns out you'll click on more ads, which appears to be the case. And these companies have very, very, very few moral barriers to doing exactly that. For those of you who are watching and interested, look up what they did to teenagers in Australia as part of their experiment with manipulating emotions.
I think that's something that a lot of people are Googling right now as we speak. Now, this brings to mind, that idea of a bubble. It's something that we at Tiffin have also been studying in our own capacity. We've noticed that narratives around history are becoming a battleground on social media between political ideologies. Why do you think that the way that the average person interacts with history has become so much more politicized and so much more incendiary than it was in the past?
I mean, it's Vietnam, it's Ukraine, it's Afghanistan. These are proxy wars. Okay. Let's take a concrete example, because I think talking about this stuff in the theoretical tends to sort of fizzle out the taste of it. Okay. Aurangzeb. All right. People are like, Aurangzeb this, Aurangzeb that, Aurangzeb was the best, Aurangzeb was the worst, blah, 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 blah. I'm not an expert on history on World War II, but outside of that, not really. Right. The problem is you're not talking about Aurangzeb. Right. The moment you engage with people on this discussion, you got to be super careful because you've already lost. Because when you're talking to someone and someone says, hey, Aurangzeb was good or bad, and let's say you have the opposite opinion, whatever that may be, I don't even care. The moment you get into that, let's say someone is saying Aurangzeb was bad and you're saying Aurangzeb was good, that he was, let's say, not out of sync with other rulers in his time, right? Perhaps by modern sensibilities, but like in his time, he wasn't that bad. Let's say that's the argument you're making. The problem is what happens if 5 years from now, there is concrete evidence that the dude used to eat babies every night? Not even kidding. Suppose this comes out, right? And you quote unquote lose that argument. The problem is the argument isn't about Aurangzeb at all. It's a lie. What they're saying is sort of, oh, the Jews killed our Lord sort of thing. It's like, you know, are Muslims today in India good or bad people? That's the underlying argument being made, right? So if you don't make that clear, you've already entered into the wrong battle. Because historical personalities, as we've seen with all the statues toppling in the West, so to speak, it's a matter of time until you find out something really bad about them. Everyone has flaws, right? You know, the good is often interred with the bones, so let it be with Caesar, so on, right? So whenever you have these arguments, you got to be very careful that, wait, we're talking about Aurangzeb, right? But I want to make it very clear, even before we start this discussion, that that dude has nothing to do with any living Hindu, Muslim, Uttar, Dakshin, nothing today, right? It's kind of even like stupid to assume why would a random, let's say, if I were Muslim, why would I look up to Aurangzeb as a person I identify with as opposed to Abdul Kalam? Like, it's a stupid statement on so many levels, it's not even funny. But
it's constructing a scapegoat for people to basically have a justification. This person we are going to say was bad, and by association, you become responsible for them. And so now everybody has to have that discussion because it's relevant to their daily lives.
Yeah, but it's a lie. So even before, so a lot of these historical discussions are red herrings. What you're doing is you're saying, oh, Hindus today or Muslims today or this subgroup today is good, bad, ugly, whatever. And because it is unfashionable to have these discussions out openly, you rely on this historical narrative, right? And you try and construct loads of different historical narratives, and it's pathetic. It is a petty game meant for superficial minds.
Well, your feelings on that are very clear, and I think I share them. I do have one question, though. It seems like this discussion that we're having, we as individuals have the capacity to disengage or maybe even shut these down by pointing out, like, you know, that none of this is relevant to our daily lives. It doesn't impact people. But my question is that now, like, there's so much misinformation going on. There's so much a construction of false narratives. How do we as individuals build the capacity to spot these where they come up?
It's really hard. I mean, there's a reason why these narratives succeed, right? It's this fake news succeeds because it's remarkably easy to make high quality fake news. Let's put it that way. Because people, if you mentally agree with something, if it fits your worldview, it's really hard to make yourself, you know, get off your butt and actually fact check something, right? It's incredibly, incredibly difficult, right? It just doesn't work. What you can do is, I tend to obey this rule. Try and break the chain between your feelings and what you're posting out loud, right? My thumb rule is, if I want to post something, I'll write it down. I'll even perhaps save it as draft, you know, let's say I'm making a Facebook post or whatever. I will not post it for 24 hours. If after a day I still feel that it's important, I'll post it. Right? But if I don't, I'm just not going to do that. That 24-hour gap, you'll find removes like 95% of everything you post. Right? It's because these platforms are designed, this sort of peer pressure is designed to make you feel a certain way. Right? It's a combination of many different things. It's that fake knowledge situation that I talked about, combined with the fact that you are constantly being pressured by everyone to sort of stand up for what is right, which is a joke, right? Because you're constantly being told that, okay, let me put it this way. When discourse breaks down, it happens in multiple steps. Initially, it starts with denounce evil. Then the next step is denounce everyone who is associated with evil. The next step after that, denounce everyone who isn't denouncing evil. Right? And we are, depending on which country you live in, you're very much somewhere between the second and third. Right? So it's like, wait, you don't hate Modi, you suck immediately. Right? Or you're a Democrat, like you represent everything that's wrong with the world, depending on whatever your political inclinations are. And I think that the moment discourse gets to that point, you're in trouble. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mess.
So what I'm hearing from you is that if we just take the time to consider what we're saying, we realize that maybe we don't actually need to get involved in this. Maybe we don't need to, put this on the permanent record. Is that a correct interpretation?
It's not even as powerful as that. You said it much better than I did. It's like, it's not even consider what you're saying. It is just put a time gap, because these platforms and this peer pressure and this pressure to be shown as part of your group, because people are denouncing people who are not denouncing evil. So you need to stand up and be counted all the time on every single topic. And there's no way you have the cerebral sort of time scale, or I don't know, the cerebral capacity to simultaneously have opinions on so many different things. You just don't, right? Fine, maybe you know enough about transgender issues to have an opinion on that. Do you know enough about RBI policy? Maybe. Do you know enough about farm laws? No, you don't. You can't, not about everything. And the problem is because you have to be counted up about everything. Everyone's posting about everything all the time, and you have to stand up and be counted. Because in this sort of permanent virtual crowd, presence is a form of power. The New York Times has more presence than you. And if you're constantly in this rat race for having more presence, greater influence, whatever you want to call it, right? And that peer pressure combined with this availability of information that you think is actually knowledge or expertise, that's just a very, very, very toxic concoction. The only other thing I'd recommend is whenever you Google something, also Google the opposite.
Okay, I think that's a really cool way of going about it. When you were talking about just having an opinion on everything, it reminded me about this concept that I'd heard of history speeding up, of how in the past you could almost you had this idea of decades where like this was a big movement of the decade, this was a big change. Today it feels like we have another big movement starting up every year, maybe even every few months. So my question is that do you think it will be possible in the future to look back at this time and to construct some sort of shared opinion of, oh, this is what the 2010s were like? Or is it just going to be as confusing then as it is today?
It's going to be very, very confusing. In fact, more, probably, right? I mean, if you look back at a few years back, even more recently, the US, during the US elections, the last couple of US elections, there was a lot of talk about electoral college and the electors and how that system works, and it's super weird, right? The reason it's weird is some of the founders of the United States, when they were making it, they had opinions on newspapers. They said that the spread of newspapers has made information flow so quickly that it is possible for a demagogue to come about and, in a wave of public emotion, win votes that they could not have won if the public had taken time to consider, which is why they put all this extra weird stuff on top that, that means that somehow true democratic representation isn't really what's happening, right? Because they wanted to protect against that. I wonder what they'd have thought of social media, right? Like it is definitely the case that this is messing up our entire democratic system.
Okay. I mean, that's a lot to think about. And it feels, my question here is, do you feel like social media, like this is a really broad question, but do you feel like there is a way for us to come out of this having benefited more from social media and the information age rather than being harmed by it?
I don't think you can look at social media as a singular tool or entity, because is WhatsApp social media, is Facebook social media, is Twitter social media, is an MMORPG social media, right? It's really hard to draw these lines after you get to a certain point. What I think is far more useful is this. You can think of this in two ways: one as a citizen, and two as a regulator, right? As a citizen, it is important. I'm not always successful in doing this, but I tend to, how people are very careful about their opinions when they're talking outside with external people, but when you're talking in your friend group, you tend to be more free. You say what you think and so on and so forth. Because you're like, hey, I can make these 15 Holocaust jokes and nobody's going to think lesser of me, right? It is important to turn that around, because far more important than what other people think of you is what thoughts you put in your head, right? And in this cacophony that is social media now, it is tremendously important to curate your own mind carefully, right? And that I've been trying to do that, and I don't always succeed. And I think there's a lot to be done socially around this. That is, I don't think regulation is going to solve all our problems, right? I think there need to be much stronger social norms as to what's okay on, let's say, Facebook or something. And it's a minefield. It's really bad because, okay, let me put it this way. I don't see any women on this particular call, but go talk to some of your female friends and ask to see their, if they're okay with that, their Facebook Messenger, especially the spam and the unanswered, random people contacting you, right? I knew jack about this until I saw my own wife's account, right? I had no idea it was this bad. Right. And it's crazy. You have completely random people across age groups just messaging women constantly. Right. And like, how do you stop that? What do you do? The problem is, because as a society, we tend to ignore certain things. It becomes difficult to regulate because you don't even know how big or small certain problems are. Similarly, when you're looking at social media as a whole, if you want to sort of, as you said, come out of it better than when you started, you at least need to identify what all of these problems are. Right now, the way I see it, the problems are, the hardest problems are not even fake news, in my opinion. The hardest problem right now, number one in my head, is bullying, right? The number of teenage suicides is highly correlated with social media right now. Increase in suicides. And a lot of it has to do with, well, before, when you got bullied, you were only bullied when you were, let's say, at school or something. When you came back home, that was a safer space. But now you're constantly connected and therefore essentially quadrupling the time that you're bullied, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's, with like the number of fake news related deaths versus the increase in teenage suicides is not even like very obvious what you should focus on first, right? And then there are concrete actions that these platforms can and sometimes do take, but I think regulators need to get a lot more involved in this stuff. As far as fake news is concerned, I don't see that as a very easily winnable battle. Because, okay, I'll just stop after the statement. Do you know what Russell conjugations are? Have you heard of it?
No, this is my first time.
They are similar words with different emotional connotations.
Yes, I think I've heard of this. He was a Republican strategist, right? And he was a guy who
No,
came.
you're thinking Frank Lutz.
Oh, okay.
No, that's also a very interesting story. Death taxes. No, but this has to do with things like I am determined, you are stubborn, he is pig-headed. You're saying essentially the same thing, but very different emotional connotations. We see this far more often with words like strongman, dictator, tyrant, or freedom fighter, insurgent, militant, terrorist. And what words you use to describe something can have a huge effect, even though you're reporting the same kind of news, right? And you can do some very nice sort of people have done this with various famous newspapers around the world, The Guardian, New York Times, etc., seeing how their opinions influence what words they use. And you can actually see this, especially with the New York Times, as US State Department policy changes towards, let's say, Panama or something. Suddenly, within 24 hours, the same person goes from strongman to tyrant, right? And so there's a lot of this happening. So, it's not fake news. They're reporting correct things. But, a lot of these people are past masters at manipulating your emotions using words. And sure, education up to a point is good at preventing that, but not really. What education does is what I guess, the academy feared about the sophists, which is you'll have the same opinions as before, you'll just be better at backing it up, right? So I think far more than just education or regulation to prevent fake news, I think what is required significantly more is frankly a dose of empathy. I don't know how we can get there, but I think compassion and empathy have been severely undervalued as sort of online goods. And I think that needs to happen a lot more. There's a lot of forced empathy happening. You'll see a lot of ads being, look, my child is sick, donate now. That is sort of with very ham-fisted, heavy-handed sort of behavior. Look at this terrible picture. You must donate or you're a bad person. But beyond that general empathy, when discussing things with other people on social media, that has been vastly undervalued. I don't know, maybe you get empathy points for having reasonable discussions on Facebook.
I understand your point when you mean that it's hard to essentially change the psychology of people. You're trying to alter human behavior. But my question then would be, you've mentioned how for the issue of teen suicides, you said that there were things that regulators could do, that companies could do, that would have a positive effect. I want to sort of go from the abstract to the concrete. In India specifically, what do you think are policies that regulations that could be put in to sort of moderate our chat? Or do you feel that even the attempt is too dangerous, considering what you said about, India doesn't really have accountability the same way?
Well, it's a problem, right? Because you're not dealing with an Indian company. You're in most of these cases, you're dealing with these multinational entities that are exercising, in many ways, sovereign power, right? Facebook can decide whether or not to censor a post, right? That's sovereign power right there. That's not okay. But the question is, do people feel more comfortable with the Indian police censoring a post as compared to Facebook? Chances are a lot of people will be like, let the Silicon Valley people handle it, right? So I think, before we have bigger problems before we get to this fake news stuff, right? I think until we fix our own oversight systems, until we have, what happened with the whole Lokpal thing, right? Where are all the Lokpals? And until we fix all of these sort of core oversight systems, this sort of oversight infrastructure, it's not going to work.
I mean, we're trying not to get too political here because we are a history channel, but I can easily think of quite a few examples right now where people would argue that, maybe we shouldn't trust any singular authority with this sort of power, specifically about the Indian government. And I think that brings me to my perhaps final question, depending on how much time we have. We are Tiffin. We are one of these channels on a social media platform. We're on Facebook, social media like YouTube and Instagram. And my question is that we believe that we have some capacity to help, some capacity to educate. Could you let us know, and perhaps let our listeners know as well, what can we as individuals or as groups do on these online platforms? What effect can we have?
Oh, fantastic. I can tell you two things that I've wanted to do for a long time, and maybe you can do them better than I can. Number one, facilitate real debate. Okay. We don't have real debates. We have, I wish we did, but schools and colleges across India, we have fake debates. You have this many minutes, or you're doing a model UN or something else. It's all structured. It's all fake, right? What you want in a real system is you have people who actually believe in their sides and can coherently express that, and you have like a proper jhagda. I'm not even kidding. You have a proper, sometimes angry, sometimes calm thing, obviously with some barriers, with some limitations in place. I also strongly encourage turncoat systems. That is, you argue one side and then you have to argue the opposite, right? And you don't just do that by faking it. You actually sort of make yourself believe the other side's arguments. You try and understand them as best as possible. And I think that sort of thing is tremendously important. And in order to run that, and again, this is not something that I've been successful at personally, it is important to strongly believe that, hey, I believe in this, I could be wrong, right? And to start out with that. And don't pick light topics, right? Most people are cowards. They tend to pick very, very light topics that, topics that may be brave theoretically, but locally are not, right? Having a debate around Sabrimala and Ashoka, like, I know what the outcome will be, and it's pathetic that I know that fact, right? Have an interesting debate. Have actual sort of real people with opinions come in and argue, right? But it's difficult to have the balance between that and coherence. You don't want to end up with sort of 15 faces on a TV screen, right? Channels like Republic and Times Now have tried to do that, and it's terrible, right? I sometimes do turn them on just to sort of hear the cacophony. It's fun. So that's one suggestion, these facilitating debates thing. The second is harder than this even, which is summarizing complex debates, right? And that is incredibly difficult to do. What you want to try and do is you want to take an issue. Let's say, for example, since I mentioned one temple 30 seconds ago, let's take the Ram temple issue. Gogoi recently had that thing come up. And you try and express the core points around it in 1 or 2 pages. I don't think, in shorts is the right length for this. But I think a 2-page, 3-page, and you'll probably have to do some A/B testing for this to figure out what is the right length where you can put in enough data and people will still read it, right? Something like that would be incredibly, incredibly valuable, but again, also incredibly difficult to do.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's still human beings who have to compile and create those, those summaries, and that's obviously going to have a lot of bias in it, like conscious or unconscious. And I think we have enough time for me to ask a follow-up question. You've talked about, having those debates with both sides, and I agree with you on, I would say, most of these. But again, I do have a strong opinion of my own. I can't help but think of something like the flat earth or the anti-vax movement that have gone on, where people say, I have an opinion, there is therefore a debate, even though it goes against scientific consensus. And, you know, common sense is, as I say, not very common. But at the same time, there are some things where you feel like, really? Do we need to clarify that the earth is round? So my question is, how do we foster that culture of being open-minded without at the same time throwing open the doors to every person who comes in and says, actually, I think the lizard people are controlling society.
Right. So, the joke that if you open your mind too much, your brains will fall out. You're right. But I think that is an issue that is, okay, how should I, do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Right. I think the vast majority of debates that people will have are going to be perfectly reasonable. Sure, you'll have one odd issue turn up from time to time. Someone who thinks that, the earth is flat or something else, right? Yeah, sure. Once in a while, this is the thing. The problem with mathematicians and philosophers, you and I, perhaps, we tend to desire these perfect situations. It's not the case. It's okay to have some dirt. It's okay to say that, okay, look, as long as you keep a list, right? It's like someone approached us for this debate. I decided this was a stupid debate. We're not going to have it. If you want to have it, you can have it on your own. Fair enough, it's okay. You don't need to be this perfect neutral judge. Perfection is for governments. Okay. What is far more important, if you're acting as a curator, own it. And I say the same sort of thing about people who say check your privilege. I don't think, as you said, you can't check your privilege. You can't overcome your biases in that simple fashion. What you can do is take responsibility for it. Right? You can say, I wrote this. I know I'm not neutral, but this is me. This is my opinion. Right? And I think that it's really important to foster that attitude, because otherwise what we have is, with this guy who recently became the CEO of Twitter and so on, some people dug up a post from like 10 years back, right? Like, what kind of joke is that? So I think we need to have this idea that, yes, it's okay to have had the wrong opinion 2 years ago, 20 years ago, 2 months ago. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a difference between having had a wrong opinion. People change. And allowing that change is really, really, really important. So I think you guys have an opportunity to do a lot of good. As long as you, like I said, probably don't try to be too perfect. Just own what you do.
Thank you for that. I think that's really a wonderful note to end this on. We just want to thank you, Professor Gupta, for taking the time to speak with us today. And we want to thank our listeners as well. We hope that this was as fun for them as it was for us. And I certainly have learned a lot more. And I have, I think, a lot more questions than I started with, which is always a good place to end on. We just like to end with, just another message to our listeners. Please make sure to catch our next expert interview and other cool content by subscribing to us on Spotify, our YouTube channel, and our Instagram. All of them have the same handle, Tiffin History. That's TIFF.IN History. We've made lots of videos and posts that summarize complex issues for you to consume whenever you'd like, in whatever length you'd like. Until next time, take care, everyone.